Welcome to another video in our series wandering through books from the shelves behind me as we talk through their methodology, not simply their content. Till now, we've been working through lots of tools of base philosophical analysis, how arguments are structured, how we construct meaning, how events transform our understanding of meaning through time. Last week, we spent a lot of time going through Whitehead, who identified and worked with an interesting gap that exists between experience and the meaning we derive from it. An internet commenter, however, got on me for calling Whitehead a materialist. And they're right. I was loose with my language and probably speaking too quickly. You see, prior to Whitehead, and many others really from here out, there was a split in philosophy that drove most thought. It's a dichotomy that we might call today the dichotomy of the mental and the material. You see, we have ideas about things that seem immaterial, and we have things themselves that seem to have no ideality built in. So with these two things, what comes first? A chicken and the egg thing. Which drives the other? Do we live in a world where my ideas drive change in the world of things, or do things drive changes in the world of ideas? Whitehead really hated this dichotomy. He rejected materialism and idealism as fraught categories themselves. Yet I did call him a materialist. Well, I was anticipating this book coming next, and actually a lot of other books that come after this to do a very different thing, and it's not fair for me to do that. It's fair to be called out for, but goddamn, these things are really hard to write every single week. They really are. So today, we're going to dive into that dichotomy of the mental and the material with Maurice Godelier's The Mental and the Material. Yeah, it's a name. You can go find it. See, let's start there. Most people think you have to pick sides in that fight. But Godelier says, no, this is actually not two bad categories, but instead a false choice that misses how social life actually works. And unlike Whitehead, who explicitly did reject materialism because it was reductive and oversimplifying, Godelier embraces a new kind of materialism, one that understands how mental and material aspects of life are already intertwined. The goal here isn't to choose between them, but to analyze and sit with their simultaneity, their coextensiveness. So yes, internet commenter, you did get me. Should have known eventually this would happen. That's what happens when you make a video series. So let's start simply. The Mental and Material, title of the book. It's a long-standing dichotomy. Dichotomy in philosophy is a division into two mutually exclusive categories. Famous ones include things like mind and body, nature, culture, individual, society. These splits feel natural, even while I'm saying them, but they're analytical constructions that often distort more than they clarify. Take the classic man versus nature dichotomy, right? This framework presumes that man and nature aren't the same, that man stands outside nature as a observer or objective manipulator. But we are nature. We are evolved biological beings embedded in ecological systems at large. Dichotomy creates an artificial separation that makes environmental destruction seem natural, rather than recognizing it as historical developments of itself. What's the difference between a nest and a city, after all? Godelier's anthropological work reveals how these dichotomies begin to break down, and they do it when you examine social practices themselves. He did this as an ethnologist. Now, ethnology is its own thing we'll get to. His field work with the Baruya people of Papua New Guinea is the brunt of his work. The way he did this is basically opening a window on not just how tribes function, but how people function. Before we dive into Baruya, I've got to talk about ethnology, though. This isn't far from kind of what we were talking about before when we went through the Nietzsche video on philology. Ethnology is also one of those things that sort of is a victim of the nature of how, you know, the Germans were naughty, so we got rid of a bunch of stuff that they talked about and that they were specializing in. Ethnology, specifically, is the comparative study of human societies and cultures with a focus on how different groups organize their social lives, the production of things, and how they make meaning. It showed up in the 1800s as European societies started to encounter radically different forms of social organization around the world that challenged assumptions about what human nature really was. The Baruya of Papua New Guinea are a highland people who Godelier got a chance to study from the 60s through to the 80s.
Anthropologists go to New Guinea because they think that they have to find very different sorts of societies, very different from what is now existing in their own society. So they prefer to go to the most distant and the most different societies.
They are a group that practices a bit of hunting, gathering, horticulture. They organize their society through very complex kinship systems that determine everything from marriage patterns to territorial access. But here's what's methodologically crucial. Among the Baruya, kinship relations simultaneously organize multiple domains that we treat usually as very separate. Marriage and descent patterns, we're going to call these things social reproduction here, they operate through the same kinship categories that determine territorial access, what land a person has, or resource control. These are things we might call material production at large.
He tells Maurice that a typical harvest requires 4 days of grass cutting. The salt grass has been harvested and burned, and the salty ashes placed in gourds for filtration. These filtration racks are owned by Warrener and his family.
These categories, though, they also structure cosmological understanding. How the Baruya understand their relationship as a whole to ancestors, to spirits of the forest, to natural forces that sort of encompass their lives as they go.
The tree is decorated with magic leaves, black feathers from the bird of paradise, and cowrie shell necklaces belonging to the young men. These are all offered to please the spirit of the tree, for if the spirit is angry, it will take away the strength of the men as it falls.
And they organize political authority who has the power to make decisions and exercise control through these same things.
You married or you married? Single married. But suppose you go nampish, you and your making one which has never kissing pay blue.
Yes.
Pay one in Baratam blue.
Yes.
The critical insight isn't that just kinship affects these domains. It's that these aren't separate functions that kinship influences or also performs in. Instead, they're the same process viewed from different analytical angles. Think of it like looking at a complex geometric object. If you look at it flat on, you might say, well, it's a triangle. And yeah, that's a triangle. But if you turn it just a little bit, a pyramid might begin to emerge. Mental categories work like this. Who counts as kin, for example, directly structures material practices about who can access what resources that are around and how we relate. Among the Baruya, when someone's classified as a cross cousin, it's a unique sort of category that they have. This mental categorization immediately determines their marriage possibilities, their territorial access rights, ritual obligations, religious obligations, and the position within that larger scale political hierarchy. The categorization isn't separate from these material effects. It constitutes them directly. But consider how material constraints work in the opposite direction, actually determining who gets classified as a cross cousin in the first place. Take two Baruya groups who find themselves sharing territory, and they have complementary but different resources. One group might have a palm grove, another great hunting grounds. Easy. Marriages between these groups would be really advantageous. But they don't have any cross cousin. Well, the kinship system would respond, and does respond, by reclassifying members of each group as appropriate cross-cousins. This enables beneficial marriages. Okay? So what appears as an abstract sort of kinship rule that's always true is actually more material necessity organizing social categories as they go. The groups aren't marrying because they're cross-cousins. They're becoming cross-cousins because marriage serves material and social reproduction. This weird bidirectional causation, oscillation, reveals how mental and material are co-constitutive. They emerge and create together, and they shape each other through continuously ongoing social practice. Neither has priority. Neither determines the other. Instead, they form what we might call mental material arrangements that function as integrated wholes. And this is kind of an interesting thing to start considering, because if we're talking about certain ideas and practices becoming dominant and getting together, how is it some do that and others fall by the wayside, become marginalized? Well, people in a lot of sort of analytical or philosophical or social spaces will use the term hegemony. The term hegemony comes from the Greek word of leadership, but it's not really that. In social analysis, it refers to a specific form of social dominance, one that works through consent and practical effectiveness rather than force alone. It's a very important distinction, actually. See, pure force, say a slave and his master. It's not a hegemonic relation. That's just domination. The slave obeys because disobedience means death or torture, outright, visibly. But zoom out a bit from that immediate relationship, and you might see something that's not simple domination. You might see something that's more hegemonic. The way the antebellum South, that utilized domination as a method for capital gains, a profit, for example, also developing social meaning, right? Without which enough people wouldn't have been very happy, but with it, enough people found this to be working just fine. The slaveholding system got this, not just through the violence directed at enslaved people. That was part of it, but through the practical effectiveness in organizing all the economic, social, and cultural life of white Southern society. The slave trade provided a framework for understanding social hierarchies, economic opportunities available everywhere, racial identity, and moral order that was workable and meaningful to sufficient numbers of people to maintain the system's reproduction. Non-slaveholding whites supported slavery, not because they were coerced, generally, but because the system offered them very practical benefits, some economic opportunities, but also social status above enslaved people naturally, a cultural narrative of white superiority that made their participation in life and experience feel rational, necessary, or even positive. The system has to work for people. It had to function, not perfectly, obviously, not for everyone, but effectively enough to coordinate this large, complex nightmare of social activities we live in across massive populations over huge hundreds of years, large time periods. Social relations achieve hegemonic status not through imposition, but by successfully functioning as relations of production, by organizing how societies appropriate nature and reproduce themselves materially and socially. And this is where Godelier shines. This effectiveness is a principle of his. It's central to understanding how certain mental material arrangements become dominant. Because ideas aren't really it. They don't become hegemonic because they're true or make the most sense or something I like. They're dominant because they successfully coordinate complex social activities while making particular arrangements seem natural, necessary. Consider how religious ideas dominated traditional Indian caste society and still do in terrifying ways. Religious categories of people weren't just beliefs that floated above material life. They organized simultaneously economic production through caste-based occupational specialization. Certain people had certain jobs. A political hierarchy also through ritual statuses determining social power. Material distribution through purity rules just says what access people had to different resources. And Of course, social reproduction through marriage and kinship patterns restricted into caste membership. The religious framework achieved dominance not through magic or mystification or obfuscation or anything like that, but through practical effectiveness. It provides workable solutions to concrete problems. Things like social coordination and the material conditions we're stuck in. People participate in these things, and they participated in caste relations not because they were duped or tricked by false consciousness, but because these relations organized their actual lives in ways that felt necessary and effective, even when those lives were constrained and deeply repressed. The effectiveness principle kind of explains contemporary political phenomena that confuses pretty much every other leftist analysis that's out there. Why is it that people keep voting against their apparent material interests? We see people asking all the time. Often, they get dismissed as false consciousness, the idea that they were conned into it. Godelier's methodology, no. It examines how a political framework provides practically effective ways of organizing identity, community, and meaning under material constraints. Right-wing politics, fascist politics, often succeeds by offering frameworks that are effective for organizing daily life under capitalism. You know, the system we're in. Even when those frameworks reproduce harmful conditions or ultimately are detrimental, that doesn't matter. They provide ways of making sense of economic insecurity, social fragmentation, cultural change that translates into concrete practices that people can perform and do, share and like. What the fuck has left-wing politics offered? Critiques that don't translate into practically effective alternatives for organizing anything socially. Usually they barely even touch the material realities of things. Ironic, given supposedly the foundation of such a view. Neither position represents truth or delusion, though, as I said. Both are attempts to create effective frameworks for living under specific material conditions. The question isn't which ideas are correct, but what arrangements provide sufficient practical effectiveness to coordinate life. Now, this analysis requires a specific approach, and Godelier kind of develops this thing across his anthropological training. As we said, you can't understand social systems from pure outside observation. You have to be in them, but you also can't understand them from purely inside experience. You need analytical distance. The method he has demands what we might call tarrying with the contradiction. To tarry remains to stay there longer than expected. It means you're going to hang out, you linger deliberately, rather than rushing towards a resolution. Tarrying with contradiction means staying with the tension between participation and analysis, immersion and distance, rather than collapsing them into a pure objectivity or pure subjectivity or pure simplicity. Godelier's approach involves moving constantly between this ethnographic detail and abstract theoretical reconstruction. You can see it in his writings and his work. You have to live in these systems, as he did, but you have to develop structural analysis that reveals how these systems organize broader social relations. It's great. I recommend all his books. This methodology applies beyond, though, anthropology. He hints at this, especially in this book that we're talking about here. Understanding how philosophical concepts function, as we're trying to do, also requires participating in philosophical communities and practices while developing a structural analysis that reveals how these practices organize broader social relations. Right? You need a systematic tracking of how concepts may travel between academic and non-academic contexts, detailed ethnographic attention, the material conditions of intellectual production, comparative analysis of how similar conceptual problems get addressed across different institutional settings. You might say that the key insight of all this is recognizing that analytical tools actually are embedded themselves in the systems they analyze or organize. There's no view from nowhere. No, Jordan Peterson, no. This doesn't collapse into relativism because material constraints provide limits on which frameworks can achieve practical effectiveness under given conditions. To understand how these methodological insights apply to large-scale historical analysis, I'm going to bring in another author I love, another anthropologist. And we're going to use Godelier's methodology as we make our way through Karl Wittfogel's theory of Oriental despotism. Wittfogel, who was a wonderful Marxist anti-Marxist, it's a whole thing, you'll have to look it up, argued that societies requiring large-scale irrigation systems, he called these hydraulic societies, developed what we call the state now, a centralized bureaucratic state with despotic power structures. The hydraulic society represented a specific mental material arrangement. The material requirements of coordinating massive irrigation networks, right, created pressures for a centralized administration. But this isn't some sort of technological determinism. The mental frameworks that made such coordination possible simultaneously shaped how the material infrastructure got organized in itself. They come together. So take a hydraulic society like Egypt, China, Mesopotamia. In all of these, the state achieved dominance by successfully functioning as the organizer of material production through water management. But this practical effectiveness required specific mental representations, cosmological frameworks that legitimize central authority, administrative categories that organize complex bureaucratic hierarchies, legal concepts that justified state control over land and labor. Take Egypt. In Egypt, they had Ma'at, which is a system of like cosmic truth, sort of karmic-y, right? It's order, justice, these other things. All of this, though, was tied to how the Nile flooded and then drained, specifically having a single God-man on earth, guarantor of both nature and social harmony of flows in and out, Pharaoh. The administrative apparatus reflected this cosmology through this ridiculously elaborate bureaucratic hierarchy of water officials, surveyors, corvée organizers, who were also simultaneously not just bureaucrats, but religious functionaries. The annual redistribution of flooded lands, which happened every year, required a huge amount of mathematical and astronomical knowledge, geometry for remeasuring boundaries and setting them up, astronomical calendars for flood prediction or the timing of this, and all of this knowledge was monopolized by this priestly administrative class. As Wittfogel notes, quote, these mathematical and astronomical operations became the means both for improving hydraulic production and bulwarking the superior power of the hydraulic leaders. What about Sumer? They had priest kings called Ansi. They derived their legitimacy from their role as earthly representatives of water deities like Enki, right? The cosmos was conceived as fundamentally dependent on divine water management. The gods themselves created the world by channeling primordial waters. Human society just replicated this divine hydraulic order. Magically, right? Ziggurats, you've seen those before, right? They serve as a religious center. Not just that, they also were an administrative hub for water management, physically embodying the connection between a cosmic order and the control of water. Temple complexes functioned as redistribution centers throughout the state where surplus from irrigated agriculture was collected and reallocated according to these water priorities determined by the state. Even the Code of Hammurabi extensively regulated water rights and canal maintenance obligations, treating these things not as like some economic arrangement, but as like an expression of divine justice. Neglecting irrigation duties was both practically and cosmically criminal. The legal fiction that all land ultimately belonged to the gods, administered, of course, by their earthly priestly representatives, justified comprehensive state control over the entirety of agricultural production. And ancient China, which probably couldn't get less Western, is maybe the most explicit. They had this thing called the Mandate of Heaven that's very, very, very old. Very old. And the concept itself considered floods and droughts as divine signs that leadership is failing, like omens. The legendary Great Yu, the founder of the Xia dynasty, right, achieved legitimacy precisely through controlling water successfully, establishing this like template for future leaders where political authority would be derived from hydraulic mastery. The bureaucratic state in China, which is insane, is the system of selecting officials. This started in like Han times, culminated in like the imperial examination system. It Communist Party still has a huge bit of this in there. It's kind of incredible. Tested candidates on classical texts. But all these texts really emphasize the ruler's responsibility for water management, flood control. So there's like this automatically and ideologically committed administrative class to hydraulic governance. That is what good rule is. It's in the Tao. Confucian political theory treated water management as like the paramount demonstration of virtue that justified hierarchical authority. The emperor's ritual responsibilities included ceremonies ensuring proper seasonal rains and flood control. I mean, Christ, they created legal concepts like the well field system, which organized land tenure around irrigation requirements, while justifying, of course, state appropriation of surplus as necessary for hydraulic maintenance. Get it? The effectiveness of these mental material arrangements is why they were persistent. People participated in hydraulic despotism, not because they were threatened with being, drowned or not given water. No, it's because these systems provided workable solutions to concrete problems of survival and social coordination under very specific ecological constraints. The despotic elements are not bugs in the system. They were features that made the system functionally effective. But effective is the core word here. Effective doesn't mean perfection. Wittfogel's hydraulic societies were characterized by what Godelier would go on to call the effectiveness of the imperfect, which is just such a fucking great line. These systems would reproduce themselves, absolutely, but not by achieving great conditions for everyone or even slightly good, but by being functional enough to coordinate social activities. That's it. Their effectiveness comes from the ability to just make life workable, not to create human flourishing. It's like if it ain't broke, don't fix it, but applied to like the social order, right? Because it's not just that these systems worked. They carried on. And while it seems like a lot of these things have existed forever, the reality is that they were transferred generation to generation, even to us, not by magic or some other silly shit. If you're going to understand how these systems self-perpetuate, it begins with understanding how social forms reproduce themselves through the daily practices of people who may not fully understand how the system works or that there's a system at all. In hydraulic societies, this self-reproduction worked through a feedback loop between mental representations and material practices. Administrative categories shaped how irrigation systems were organized, while the practical requirements of water management reinforced the necessity of administrative hierarchies. Cosmological frameworks of myth that legitimized state authority were reinforced by the actual effectiveness of state coordination in maintaining productivity with agriculture. This methodology explains why certain political formations seem to reproduce themselves, regardless of their horrifying failures. They successfully coordinate enough social activities to have like an institutional base. They adapt their content while preserving their effectiveness. And they create feedback loops where their practical effects reinforce the conditions that make them seem necessary. I mean, this is not old-timey stuff. This is, we can see this. Consider now, right now, how neoliberalism has reproduced itself despite repeatedly creating economic crises. Trump's a neolib, no matter what any conservative wants to say otherwise. Flatly. I mean, I'm 45. There's been a catastrophic stock market failure 6 times, maybe 7. And when I say catastrophic, I mean big. There's a lot of smaller ones. The system has continually gotten worse and fallen apart for everyone. But the neoliberal framework achieves effectiveness, not by creating this prosperity, but by providing workable approaches to organizing our lives under the conditions of a global competition. Market-based solutions feel effective to many people because they kind of give us a concrete practice. Start a business. Consume a thing. It's up to you, the individual with responsibility. That shit. These things provide ways of navigating economic insecurity, the world we live in. When neoliberal policies create problems, the framework generates explanations that reinforce rather than challenge core assumptions. Economic crises get blamed on insufficient market freedom rather than market logic itself. It's not false consciousness. It's not ideology. It's the logical self-reproduction of mental material arrangements that's achieved sufficient practical effectiveness. That's it. This analysis fundamentally challenges how we understand economic relations in totality and also what we can do with it, rather than treating economics as a base that determines everything else, or worse, treating economics as like one domain amongst many. Godelier shows how economic relations are embedded in these mental material arrangements. He's kind of standing up against another guy, Karl Polanyi. He's kind of the guy he's going up against is one of the ones I recognized. See, Polanyi argued that in pre-modern societies, economic relations are embedded in social institutions, rather than operating as a separate market. This is a step in the right direction. It's a little right, but it's a frustrating view still because there's this dichotomy, again, that leads somehow to less understanding, not more, as if there's an essential economic core that gets placed inside non-economic containers. Godelier, he pushes a different way. He says, no, economic relations are always already constituted. They're there through the mental representations while simultaneously shaping those representations in the material. There's basically no pure economic to embed. Instead, what we call economic emerges from the arrangements of things. So we go back to the Baruya. When Baruya men clear forest land for the gardens, this is not just a purely economic activity happening within kinship relations. As others may say, the act of clearing land simultaneously constitutes kinship relations, cosmological understanding and political authority and economic production all at once. You can't really separate any of these things out at all. Economic aspects aren't pulled out because there's not one. There's the integrated mental material practice of land clearing that we fragment analytically as we talk about it into separate domains we use to understand it. The mental representations, concepts of lineage, ownership, spiritual obligations, masculine identity, productive responsibility, these aren't ideas about economic activity. They're economic activity in a concrete form. Similarly, the material practices, chopping down trees, preparing the soil, planting techniques of seeds, all that, these aren't simple physical actions. No, they're the enactment of kinship obligations, of cosmological principles, of the political relationships and economic strategies. Concrete. The point is, you can't understand economic relations by abstracting them from these arrangements in which they're embedded. But you also can't understand mental representations without analyzing how they organize material processes and vice versa. Economics is not the base that determines superstructural ideas. Instead, economic relations achieve effectiveness through being constituted as mental material arrangements that include what we analytically separate as ideas and practices as integrated elements. And this applies, as I said, to contemporary capitalism. Market relations don't operate by some abstract economic law. You're free to show me the ones that work. I ain't seen it. Neither has anyone who's fucking got a doctorate in economics. These rules function as mental material arrangements again. Take something like buying coffee. It's like a very simple version of this. Doing this, though, involves legal frameworks like property rights, contract law, import-export, tariffs, cultural narratives, lifestyle branding, or ethical consumption of coffee, of fair trade, which kind of ties into the first one. There's technological infrastructures of the entire thing, not just payment systems and shipping systems, but like the entirety of that craziness of like the global supply chain. There's subjective orientations of like the taste of coffee you like, or how much of a hipster fuck you really are. Material practices also embedded. The growing, processing, serving, and consuming of coffee can't be extricated from any of this. You cannot separate an economic transaction from these assemblages of things, because the transaction is these things in their concrete operation. Understanding how capitalism works requires analyzing these arrangements, instead of treating them as domains that are separate and sort of touch or influence each other. The mental and material aspects don't influence each other. They constitute each other as integrated processes of social reproduction. It's tough. Godelier's methodology is a very sophisticated tool for understanding how mental and material aspects of social life work together to create this world we live within. But what makes this approach powerful is how it synthesizes insights from so many other traditions, by doing so creating new tools that others, like Deleuze and Guattari and more, will go on to use. Godelier was taught by Claude Levi-Strauss. Levi-Strauss, apologies. Godelier employs his structural analysis to reveal underlying patterns in social organization, but instead of heading towards that like synchronic analysis, he develops like a historical method for understanding how structures emerge, persist, and transform over time. He may have gotten that from a guy named Marx. And like Marx, Godelier emphasizes this importance of material conditions and productive relations, but unlike a crude Marxist determinism, his approach shows mental representations being constitutive elements of material, rather than reflections of a material economic base. There's even some Weber in there if you want to give the book a read Sunday. The work isn't eclectic. It's not borrowing randomly. It's a genuine conceptual innovation throughout. He creates new tools that handle the complexity of mental-material simultaneity without reducing it to materialist or idealist formulations that drove Whitehead so nuts. His methodology moves thought forward, providing concepts to be used by others facing different problems in different contexts. And to me, this is philosophy at its best, not defending eternal truths, but creating tools for thinking that can handle complexity without reducing it. Godelier's framework explains contemporary political phenomena without falling into crude determinism or a naive voluntarism. It shows how to trace a logical genesis of social formations while remaining attentive to their practical effectiveness and material conditions, understanding how to make change. The goal with this video is not to make you an expert in Godelier. Go read his books, but instead to learn how this kind of understanding works so you can begin acquiring equipment. See what becomes visible when you stop choosing sides, allow yourself to tarry, analyze the simultaneity. When you stop presuming exclusive disjunctions of things, understanding instead the power of the inclusive disjunction within logic. And you better, because next week is like the daddy of all this. We're going to be spending time with Marx and his dialectical methodology and how it functions and how it inspired kind of everything else here. Speaking of, though, things you can do that are material. If you appreciate this and the other videos I've put out, please do head to patreon.com/DGQC. Join up for the cost of a coffee a month, more if you can afford it. Otherwise, don't worry about it. If you're intrigued and you want to begin your journey in philosophy, join our Discord. Join the Quarantine Collective at discord.gg/DGQC. And as always, I'll see you guys soon enough.